to Children's Services Overview and Scrutiny meeting. I'd like to ask you all to ensure that any mobile devices such as Alexa, goggle boxes or mobile phones have been switched off. Just attend to mine. Oh no. The only people permitted to speak at this meeting are the members of the committee and the relevant officers. To minimise background noise, when you're not currently speaking or being asked to speak, please do mute your microphone. If you don't mute, Lucian will mute it for you. To assist the flow of the meeting, could everybody except the Scrutiny Committee members turn off their cameras and only turn them on when asked to speak? The procedure in this meeting will be the officers will present their reports. The members will then be invited to ask questions, and I will call them in alphabetical order, forwards or in reverse. Officers are asked to use the hand up function to answer questions. And I'd just like to introduce everybody who is here in the meeting. So the councillors present this evening are Abdul Loys, Andrew Mickleborough, Andy Croy, Ken Mile, Malcolm Richards, Prue Bray, and myself, Alison Swaddle. I'll be chairing the meeting. And the officers here this evening are Adam Davis, Gillian Cole, Sal Thurlaway, and from Democratic Services, making sure this all runs smoothly, is Callum Wernham and Lucian Bowker. And we also have a member of the public with us this evening who'll be asking a question. So, first point on the agenda is the apologies. Lucian.
Hi, I have apologies from Jenny Cheng, Pauline Haley-Simons and Carol Cames.
Thank you. Next item 16, the minutes. I hope all members have been able to read the minutes from 17th of June 2020. Does anybody have an amendment they'd like to put forward?
Not an amendment, but I'd like to pick up a point if I can, Alison. It's Prue.
Is it something that is being covered later in the agenda? Or?
No.
Okay, go ahead then.
Okay, it's on page. Sorry, I have to look for the page. Page 9. It was resolved that the committee would receive regular updates by the Children's Services Executive member. We don't have such an update on the agenda. I was wondering, was that planned? I can't remember whether we said every meeting or every other meeting or something.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And the lead member for Children's Services was asked if she wanted to attend to give an update, and she felt at this point in time there wasn't anything significant, and she looks forward to joining us at the next meeting.
Okay. I find that slightly disconcerting given what's, the focus on education, particularly over the last few months, but I think we ought to put it on our forward plan at some point when we expect them, rather than allowing her to decide whether she wants to give us one. Thanks.
Well, I think the questions that you might have liked to ask we'll be able to address to Adam and Sal, and I'm sure they'll be very informative. Okay, so members, I'll take it that we are all in favour of agreeing to the minutes. And moving on to item 17, declarations of interest. Right, no declarations today. Public question time. Wesley Budd, thank you very much for submitting a question. Would you like to read your question?
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
We can. Do you want to put your camera on?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I'll do that as well. Thank you. Yes, thank you. My question is, there is evidence nationally that just before schools closed for the summer holidays, pupils from more deprived backgrounds were least likely to return to school, and that this is one of the number of factors that will further widen the social, developmental and academic attainment gaps between children from poorer and wealthier socio-economic backgrounds. What can Woking Borough Council do to ensure that this aspect of the return to school is monitored and understood by schools, and what practical interventions and support can be put in place to address this?
Thank you for your question. Certainly a matter that everybody on this committee is concerned about. We know that the coronavirus pandemic had a significant impact on a number of families in respect of their children not being able to access education for such a long period. And we recognise the efforts of parents who have supported their children's home learning throughout. However, we also know of the long-term impact of continued isolation for school-aged children, both in terms of academic achievements and social well-being. And thus, a return to school for all children is deemed to be in the best interest, and we fully support this. Woking Borough Council has continued to work with schools and settings throughout the summer period in respect of planning for the return of all pupils to school at the start of the new academic year, well, last week. We will continue our regular communication, and we have mechanisms in place to respond supportively where there are children or young people with anxieties regarding their return to school. We're working with schools and the Department for Education on seeking regular attendance data in order to monitor this with specific reference to our vulnerable learners. And we're also supporting schools in relation to utilisation of the catch-up premium and the National Tutoring Programme that was announced by the government in July in respect to supporting pupils and students to return to a consistent high level of learning outcome for all of our children and to make up for lost teaching time. This issue is also something that we will be discussing later on in this meeting with Sal Thurlaway, our Assistant Director for Children's Services, with his responsibility for schools. Mr. Budd, you're very welcome to stay for the whole meeting. Do you have a supplementary question?
No, I do not.
Would you like to ask it?
No, sorry, I don't. Thank you.
Oh, right. Sorry. We said no. Did you say no? I do.
No,
okay.
No.
Right. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Right. So next on our agenda is, I'm trying to master not printing anything out, guys. Please bear with me. Number 20, Children's Services Performance Indicators. So I hope that we have all received these and been able to have a look through. And if we start with dashboard item 1, I'm going to, can you raise your hands by clicking on the raise hand item? Is that going to be the best way to do it? No, sorry, we're going to go through. I'm going to invite the officer. I'm just looking because I'm not sure he's. Oh, Stephen, you're here to talk about the dashboard, aren't you?
Yes, I'm here in place of Nick this evening.
Okay, so Stephen, if you'd like to just highlight anything that we might not have been able to gather from reading the paper, and then members will be invited in alphabetical order to put a question.
Certainly, I'll just share the document then. If that,
I can only see Prue.
We're here. We've just got cameras switched off.
That's okay. Stephen, can you put your camera on, please?
Oh, certainly, yes.
Okay, so dashboard item 1, education, health and care plans.
Yes, I'm just having trouble sharing the, the document.
That's fine. I have to say I was very, very pleased to see 88%, which is really good. And as you've said, well above average for England.
I'm pleased to be able to say it's quite a positive picture overall for this court. Apologies.
Okay, I think members, we've all probably got this in front of us. So
that'll be easier then, if you're happy.
Yeah.
So yes, the first item. I think Sal actually has just offered to share it. So. First item, yes, education, health and care plans. So we've seen a slight increase on those this quarter. And basically the number that are out of borough stayed the same, but I'm pleased to say that, as you just pointed out, that we have a very noticeable increase in those issued within the 20-week period of expected referral. So it's, this has been a priority of the service for quite some time now, and I think the results are clearly starting to pay off, given the emphasis that's been placed on it. We are doing considerably better than our statistical neighbours and the regional average as well in regard to this indicator, I'm pleased to say. So unless there are any questions, I'll move on to item 2.
Okay, members, we're going in alphabetical order. So Abdul, do you have any questions on item 1?
Thank you, Chair. If you put your slide 1 down, question regarding send. I just want to see, it was a bit quick, I couldn't catch up. The send, the question regarding this, how well we've done with them at the moment? The question regarding special education needs.
Send. I believe it's we're doing quite well now. I don't have the figure to hand. I can certainly get it for you if you'd like the specific details of how we're doing in that regard.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Andrew?
Yes, please, thank you. I'd like to ask questions around 2 themes. Firstly, the dashboard shows a 4% growth in the number of EHCPs in the last year. That was involved 49 children. The SEND team is now fully staffed, which is excellent. But at what point would further growth in numbers of children with EHCPs require additional staffing? And is this something that we need to be proactively planning for? My second question refers to the considerable progress in the numbers of EHCPs issued within 20 weeks of referral. And this is excellent news. But could you just remind us of some of the key checks that are in place to ensure that quality is being assured? Thank you.
I think Sal perhaps would like to weigh in on that one.
Good evening, colleagues. Yeah, two really pertinent questions there. So if I can take the first, Councillor Mickleborough, which was around our demand management and sufficiency planning in both in terms of our SEND team, in order that we respond should there be a continuing growth in terms of the numbers of EHCPs that need issuing. This is an area that we'd planned for and had put forward growth in terms of the medium-term financial plan, and we've continued to do that going forward into next year as well, as this covers a range of areas, not just the SEND team, but also other elements such as our education psychology service that provides assessments to support EHCPs. So we are actively planning to ensure that we can meet capacity, meet needs, and sustain the good performance that we are seeing. In respect of the second question, we've undertaken a range of audit activity, both multi-agency. We're also seeking support of other local authorities, such as Portsmouth City Council, which are an exemplar authority in terms of SEND. to support us in some of our audit activity of cases, to ensure that actually, as you quite rightly point out, we are not losing quality to timeliness. The two things need to go hand in hand. What I'm really pleased to see is that from coming through our audits is that the assessment of multi-agency partnership working and the quality of contribution to EHCPs is improving, and we're getting a much better footprint across all of the professionals that need to support EHCPs for individual children. But it's also flagging areas for us that we need to continue to develop and continue to have our eye on in terms of improvement. You know, one such area is making sure that child and family voice is prominent within EHCPs. I think that what you see there in terms of the figures and that increase is a massive testament to the team that's been brought around this work as part of our key improvement journey for children with SEND and their families. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it certainly does, Sal. Thank you very much. Very comprehensive and reassuring answer. So thank you.
Okay, Andy Croy.
Thank you. And again, yeah, that last, the first quarter of this year, those numbers look very, very encouraging. And the text says that's been driven mostly by the improvement in staffing. I just want to ask very, very quickly, what's your feel for the way the staffing's been in the period since this report has finished? Because it seems to me that if we continue to have staffing problems, have new staffing problems, then that number's going to fall. So just a very quick update on how it's been in the period since the end of that quarter in staffing terms.
Well, you probably, sorry.
That's okay. I mean, in terms of staffing, we have seen one or two members change, and that's as interims have left the service, and therefore we've had to see new individuals to come in. In the main, the team has remained static. One of the moves forward that we will need to look to do is to get a sense of permanency within the SEND team. Colleagues will be aware that we have relied heavily on interim support in terms of making sure that we're able to meet that improvement and change the way in which we operate. Our next phase of development, which unfortunately had been slowed up by some of the COVID, was actually to start recruiting on a permanent basis into that SEND team, so that we don't see the ongoing churn. But at the moment, churn is low.
Okay, Andy?
Yes, thank you very much for that.
Okay, right. Ken, do you have a question?
No, none for this one.
Okay, Malcolm?
Yes, two very sort of quick questions, really. I'm pleased to see that the staffing levels come up from whatever it was, half level to full level now. And obviously this will have an impact on the change of direction and the numbers you're dealing with. Can I ask, are the changes due to just having the more staff, or have you actually made any changes in the processes you have and what you do? Is there a change there, or is it just increase in staff? That's the first question.
I think the change isn't just due to staffing changes. There are a number of changes that's taken place across the whole partnership that supported the timeliness element and the quality of EHCPs. So the performance for health colleagues submitting their assessment information within the 6-week period has also improved significantly. As I said earlier, the footprint for health and social care is really coming through in terms of our EHCPs. We have more recently amended our template approach to EHCPs, and we've done that in consultation with SEND Voices Wokingham and parents in order to make sure that that not just the capacity of the team, but the ways in which we work are much improved.
Thank you on that. The second question is not to do with any specific details on these charts, but from when I was on Scrutiny before on several different ones, whenever KPIs and dashboards were being produced, it would have a number in a column, several numbers in several columns, but it's not obvious, certainly to new people or those who may be out of the circle for a while, to know whether the number in that column is good. Should it be high? Should it be low? So the number 74 in the column, for instance, we don't know if that's performing badly or it's double what you were expecting. And what they did there was just simply put a column, a narrow column next to it, which is saying what would be the objective, the ideal target. Would it be like 100%? So the higher the better, or the lower the better. Is it possible in future versions of this that you could adopt the same process, so that rather than just looking at numbers and trying to then read the description and work out for yourself whether it should be high or low, you just have a single little column with what it should be, the higher the better or the lower the better? Is that possible to do in future displays for presentations?
Well, that is why we include the direction of
well,
travel.
direction of travel, yeah, but that is a direction of travel. It just means you go in there, but we don't know. If you have a number 73, for instance, and the direction of travel is getting better, we don't know whether the expectation would be that's the way you're going now. But what we're looking for is the ideal number against which we would compare it. It's a simple little column, really, which has whether it should be better, higher or lower, rather than have to read the description and maybe work out which is best.
Sal, do you want to see if you can clarify?
Yeah, I think in terms of EHCP timeliness within 20 weeks,
yeah.
Our statutory arrangement in terms of the practice standards is that all EHCPs should be completed within that time frame. So that target should be 100. However, we recognise and families recognise that for a small minority, actually meeting the 20-week deadline is detrimental to getting the quality of EHCP that they would prefer.
Right.
And also there are few cases where actual assessment activity to support the EHCP can't take place within that 20-week period because of circumstances such as, for example, children becoming hospitalised or those sorts of things. So whilst the code of practice would suggest 100%, we believe that actually somewhere around the 90 to 95% is actually more appropriate in terms of achieving that time frame, and we are on target to be moving in that direction.
Yes, I agree with that. I don't expect everything to be 100 or 0, but it was, in fact, the number in the column wasn't always 0 or 100. It was what would be a reasonable expectation. So if, for instance, 80% is what typically happens across the country or what we can reasonably expect, it's what are you reasonably aiming for, and then you can see what the number is against that. That's all. 0
I think that's the national context gives us some idea, Malcolm.
Okay.
You know,
well,
and as we can see,
yeah,
you know.
What we could perhaps do, if you think would be useful, is include targets where relevant in the narrative, then what this shows us or what action the service is taking to demonstrate whether we're moving towards our targets or away from them. Would that perhaps?
Yeah. Exactly, it's something along those lines, really, because if you're looking at a lot of scrutiny and a lot of targets and things, especially if they're mixed, some should be high, some should be low, it's useful to just have a quick indication and then you can compare against it without having to do a lot of working out beforehand. That's all. It's a simple thing, which hopefully in some future charts will be provided.
Okay, thank you, Malcolm. Prue.
Thank you, Alison. Seems a bit mean to ask for some more questions, given you've managed to get to 88%, which is absolutely fantastic, and congratulations on that. I just wondered whether there's you think there might be any latent demand because the children have not really been at school during the first 2 quarters of this financial year, whether there's any impact on people asking for EHCPs during the pandemic, and whether you think that they'll come back any stronger. And the other thing is, and I don't expect an answer necessarily tonight, but I'll be grateful if we could have the figures of how many people applied for EHCPs which weren't granted, and just to see, it gives us a better idea of the workload that you've got, because there may be, obviously you don't grant every EHCP, and I'd just like to get a feel for how many people apply and don't get them. But I don't expect that answer tonight. But if I could have an answer to the bit about whether you think there's any pent-up demand because children haven't been in school so much to be assessed, or the schools have been focusing on other things like getting ready for dealing with COVID-19 when everybody comes back, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely, Councillor Bray. I think that what we saw during the period actually was a reasonably steady amount of EHC requests coming into the local authority. However, as you rightly say, as children are now going back into school, it is likely that we will see some level of increase. However, at the moment, we're not able to ascertain what that might look like. Unfortunately, that's a bit of a time will tell over the next few weeks. I would have thought, but we are absolutely, making sure that we're responding as and when those come in. In respect to your second question, Councillor Bray, I'm more than happy to provide you a written response to that. However, I would say that actually plans that are not issued is a very low number.
Yes, that's what I would anticipate.
And that's actually a testament to our partners and our schools and other providers that are actually understanding when an EHCP is going to be of support to a child and when it may not, so therefore are not putting forward children for assessment for EHCP when actually their needs can be met outside of an EHCP. So it says something about the system that we work in as well, but I will get you the numbers.
No, thank you, and that's reassuring to know.
And just in regard to your question about the demand, our forward modelling of expected demand suggests that we'll see demand pick up, of course, once children are back at school, but it should be spread over the next few months as opposed to a sudden surge once school's back into full swing.
Right. Thank you, Stephen. Shall we go on to dashboard 2, early help?
Yes, certainly. So again, another positive figure this quarter. There's been a slight decrease in the number of referrals to early help, but members may recall that last quarter we had seen an increase as well, and in spite of that there has been an increase in the number of assessments that have been carried out over the course of the quarter, and yet in spite of that increase, I'm pleased to say that the length of time it takes to complete an assessment has dropped down again from last quarter, so we are heading back towards the average length of days it took towards the start of last year. Again, so given that there is a larger number of assessments being carried out at the moment, it is, I think, all the more commendable that the number is decreasing.
Stephen, are those working days or calendar days?
Working days, I believe.
It's quite a few weeks, isn't it?
Well, again, I think it's a testament just to the quality control aspect of what's going on. We want to ensure that what is produced is the very best for the child. So if it takes a bit longer, then it's undoubtedly worth it.
Right. Okay, I'm going to go around the councillors again. I think I confused you the first time, but it was alphabetical by your first names. I'll do it properly this time. Prue, would you like to go first? That's Prue Bray.
Thank you. I don't really mind asking whether it's first names or last names. Only one question on this, which is similar to the question somebody else asked in the last one. How is the staffing in the team, and is it sort of stable and adequate going forward?
Evening, Shall I answer that, Stephen?
Please, yes.
So the staffing in the early help service tends to be very stable. Obviously, this is Q1, which reflects a large period of lockdown where we had a number of staff that were self-isolating or shielding during that period. But the team is stable, and what we've actually started to do recently is the staff are starting to return out back to their places of work. Although they're not open to public yet, it's sort of readying ourselves for possibly that next stage of public access to those centres. But they're doing a lot of, during lockdown, there's a lot of remote assessments, remote sort of services and support, and that started getting much more activity in the community now.
Thank you. Thank you.
Andy Croy, please.
Thank you. I just want to ask about the different working arrangements your guys have had. So compared to the same quarter last year, there's not much difference. There's a few more days, and so, but yet from what you said, we seem to have fewer people working. So I'm just wondering, how has working from home impacted staff? Because it looks to me like it hasn't actually impacted their productivity at all in this area. Would that be a fair comment?
I think it's so looking at the, I suppose, considering the number of referrals coming in through the front door that may have gone to early help was reduced, and some of those assessments shown there, a number of early help assessments may have been those from the previous quarter that were being completed. But the working from home, I suppose, changed the way that we delivered services more than probably ceased those services. So groups were done remotely with families and parents via WhatsApp or video calling.
Sort of supplementary there, Andy.
Supplementary, okay. I can see what you're saying, but it just seems to me that it hasn't made any impact at all.
Impact in terms of reduction in work?
Yeah, in terms of your team's productivity, which I think is a good thing. You know, the guys are able to work from home and work remotely.
I think there's you're right in terms of if you're not out in the community travelling around, it frees up more time to maybe be working with families remotely. I think it's around whether that would be sustainable in the longer term, and that's why we're looking at returning the staff back out to the centres.
Thank you.
Okay, Abdul?
No, at the moment, Chairman. Thank you.
Ken?
No questions on this one, thank you.
Andrew?
Yes, please. Again, I'd like to ask questions around two themes. Firstly, in the minutes of the previous meeting, there's reference to developing an early help strategy, and I'm wondering if we could get a very quick update on that. There's also reference to a task and finish group on early help. I'm wondering whether they have completed their task and have had an opportunity to feed back at all yet. My second question refers to the kinds of cases that early help is maybe dealing with, and in particular, are there any examples of new types of pandemic-related cases that early help is having to deal with? And are any of these likely to require significant long-term or ongoing support? What sort of feedback has there been from the early help team about the impacts of the pandemic on their work? And in particular, are there any issues that you think the early help team would want brought to our attention here on the OVO Scrutiny Committee? Thank you.
Okay, I'll try and respond to those. Some of them are quite specific, and I don't think I'll be able to give you the full detail. So the strategy is still on its journey through sign-off and approval, and it's still got to go via the Children's Young People Partnership, which is scheduled for the next meeting. And the task and finish groups, they were scheduled, but they've been delayed, and COVID has impacted that in terms of the priorities of work that we've been focusing on over that time. But that strategy is the document's almost finished. It just needs final sign-off or endorsement with the partnership that will be responsible for part of that. In terms of cases, the type of cases early help work with, it's around so referrals may come into the front door and then go via the Early Help Hub, where they'll be distributed out. And it can be around parenting work, it can be around support, it can be a whole range of different activities. I think recently we looked at 20% of the cases may involve those where there's an emotional health and well-being, where there's support required. So the work is very varied, and also work if a case is open to children's social care, which is receiving a statutory service, it could be the journey of stepping down from that statutory service to receiving more support from that early help in the community. In terms of, I think it'd be very difficult to answer at this time around specifics that have come up as a result of COVID, and that may become more apparent later on.
We can say, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the scope of what early help we've been looking at has expanded slightly as a result of lockdown and the COVID situation. They've taken on things that they wouldn't normally have done beforehand.
So we've made some changes in terms of what early help, the work that the early help workers do in terms of focusing more on their key activity or core activity of early help, and that has enabled them to and that might be seen as an influence on the assessments as well that we're doing in terms of the timeframes on those. So we have been looking at the role and function that the early help workers take on.
Adam, could you give us an example of a case that they've branched out to help with that wasn't previously within the remit?
I think, as I said earlier, I think I'd struggle to do that at the moment, to give us specifics, because I would imagine that COVID exacerbates many situations and circumstances. So it may be a greater number or supporting families around parenting children that aren't in school and some of the issues that may arise around that. But I'd struggle to give you a specifics of an example. OK,
that's fine. Malcolm, do you have a question?
No, not on this one.
Right. Thank you very much, Stephen. Shall we move to item 3, children's social care front door?
Yes, certainly.
Can I ask you about the colour of the... Oh. So I looked at it in black and white. So are the arrows... What are the 3 colours you're using?
Black, red and green. So black indicates that there's been a change in the figure, but it is not neither a positive or a negative. Red is a negative, and green, of course, then is a positive.
I think it's fair to say is that top box there would be black, Nordney.
Yes, it should be. That is an oversight on our part, so apologies for that. Because the number of referrals is just for information as opposed to indicating a positive or negative trend.
Yeah, so, it's indicating a downward trend, but not.
Well, of course, if you print it out in black and white, you lose.
So that direction of travel, is that level of improvement? Is an improvement level going down or going up?
I think the point that Stephen was saying there was that if it's red, it's seen as a negative downward trend. If it's green, it's seen as a positive. But a black trend is a neutral because it may be beyond our control and just indicates what the trend is.
Yeah, precisely, yeah.
Well, that relates to my earlier question. So that's why I was asking. Arrows going up and down simply mean the numbers have changed. It doesn't necessarily whether it's a good change or a bad change. And so if you're using colours, that might help some of it. But photocopies won't be any use to anybody, will they? So that was one of the reasons.
We're trying to be paperless these days, Malcolm.
Oh, yeah, I'm talking about putting an extra column into that chart where it says best to be high or low. That was all. That relates back. Sorry.
OK, Stephen.
Yes, so there's been a drop in referrals through the front door since the previous quarter. Slight increase in the number which are repeat referrals, but not to a worrying extent at this stage. But there has been positively there has been an increase in the number of assessments that are completed within the 45 working days that is set as the target. So really very little change in terms of repeat referrals and just a positive change in terms of assessment times, I suppose.
Can I just add something there that I think you've covered it in, Stephen, in the text, that looking back at the numbers, we were expecting to see a 30% increase in our numbers in Q1 and Q4, and that was modelled on what we were seeing coming through the front door. Mm-hmm. So that drop in numbers is almost doesn't take into account that 30% as well. So that's probably more significant for Q1, the drop.
Mm. Indeed, and as I mentioned, when we do see that demand coming through, it will be over the course of the next 2 quarters, as opposed to just a sudden jump over Q2 this year.
Right, it's certainly very pleasing to read that having entered lockdown with a backlog, that's now being cleared. Because, yeah, I mean, the number of referrers are going to go up, aren't they, the next quarter? So Adam, do you have anything to add?
No, I think there's partly covered in here. So some of the work we've been doing with the service is the planning and modelling around what we think that may look like and how we would respond to it. So so part of it is indicated here is around ensuring that any backlog is cleared and there's capacity, and then how else we would find capacity if need be across the other teams to support the front door.
Is some of the reduction in referrals, is that because children aren't in school? And
I would say it was
schools do make a lot of referrals.
Yeah, it was. If you think back from the period of March during lockdown and probably through to June, July, there was the reduction in professional engagement or contact with families was huge. From GP visits to health visitor to school attendance would have been a key one.
Right. Okay, members, do you have any questions? Abdul?
Yes, I have. You refer that black arrows, dashboard 3, is below your control. Can you explain a bit more? How this came to?
Beyond, I suppose it's what we were saying there is that the number of referrals into the front door we cannot really control. That's around what gets referred in by other agencies. So, and really what a black arrow would show there, if there was there rather than the red one, what it should be is that it's just showing you that the numbers have gone down, but it's not seen as an issue that we need to address through performance.
Precisely,
okay.
Yes.
Okay, thanks for the explanation.
Okay, Andrew.
Yes, thank you. I'd just like to say before I ask a question that I'm really pleased tonight to hear so many references to modelling in a lot of the discussion. I think that's really, really important. So thank you for that. I'd like to ask whether you're able to identify any reasons for the more than 20% fall in the number of assessments completed within 45 working days, Q1 1922 versus Q1 2021, despite the 40% fewer referrals in Q1. And is there any anecdotal or physical evidence yet of any surge in referrals as schools return?
Did you want to answer part of that, Stephen, or shall I try and answer those?
Do you want to start and I can fill in then?
Okay, so answering those with the second one first, we haven't seen, I think it's early days in terms of school return and any potential increase, and we're probably not expecting that to come for another, I suppose, within the next month, any increase in referrals. In terms of, you're correct, in terms of the performance, although it's a green arrow indicating there's an increase, it's an increase on the previous quarter, but when you look at Q1 for last year, the percentage is significantly lower, and that's an area of focus that we're looking at. And partly that could be linked to the increase in, as we're saying, the 30% of the increase in cases we had coming through the front door of contacts. And also I think they're saying around Q1 may have cases that aren't completed that will show up in Q2 as well, the assessments there. But it is an area that we are focusing on with our performance meeting with our managers in terms of assessments, because it's not just is this just a front door assessment, Stephen, or does this covers all teams, isn't it?
I think just DTA.
Just DTA. So we are working on that in terms of, and what we're doing is we're running reports looking at those that are coming towards the edge to ensure that it's not just management sign off or any other delays that we can address that's preventing that assessment being completed within time frame.
Yes, in fact, the long-term teams do receive updates on a weekly basis of cases that are coming close to their deadline as well, so that can be addressed. And in terms of your comment on modelling, our expectation is that we will see increased numbers over the course of October and November. So that's why it hasn't appeared yet. But we do expect the numbers to go up. Just it will be spread out over the next couple of months.
Yeah, thank you, Adam and Stephen.
Andy?
I have no questions on this part. Thank you.
Okay, Ken?
No, nothing to ask on this one. Thank you.
Okay, Malcolm?
Nothing from me either. Thank you.
Thank you. Prue?
You've covered all the questions I had already. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Stephen. Let's move to item 4, child protection.
Thank you, Sal. Yes, so a slight drop in the number of children that are subject to child protection plans at the moment. But I'm pleased to say there's been a noticeable drop in the number that are on plans for a second time. And again, another positive, given that the limitations that we've faced with lockdown, what have you, there's been an increase in the number of visits that are taking place within the required timescale.
Are these actual face-to-face visits, or is this incorporate, WhatsApp or Zoom meetings with families?
Well, the virtual visits have become an element that is used now. I think the service does try to ensure face-to-face is never possible.
We have started, so we use what we called virtual visits, and we set up a practice framework for that during COVID, and we have so we started moving away from those as we moved out of lockdown, and activity was restarting in the community as well. And even looking at that in the height of lockdown, we were achieving, I think, over 50 to 60% of visits actually taking place across all cases. So we had a very high number.
That's good. I would like to commend all of your team, Adam, because I think everybody went absolutely beyond what could be expected to make sure that all our children were being visited, but that you were ensuring they were protected. From what we heard about other councils around here, I think we stood out for the dedication of our team. So please do pass on my thanks to them.
Thank you, I will do. Thank you.
Okay, Prue, would you like to be first?
Thank you. I don't think I have any questions on this really, other than the ones we've asked about the other services, which is about whether you think there's a latent demand and what your modelling is showing about how that might manifest itself and what your plans are for dealing with it.
Well, it's yes, it is interesting if you look in comparison at the figures between this quarter and quarter one of last year. They are roughly the same. As Adam's pointed out, we were expecting a 30% increase in demand. So yes, presumably we will see that manifest itself over the next quarter. Just to point out, since it seemed to cause a bit of confusion, members, if you look at the direction of travel arrow for this one in regard to children's up to CP plans, you see it's black and indicating down, which again just means that it's for information. It doesn't indicate a positive or a negative trend, as was the case with the first arrow on the previous chart.
Okay, Andy.
Thank you.
Andy Croy.
Yeah, thank you, Alison. No questions, but it's good to see the percentage kept high. I mean, now I appreciate that the visits that we're recording are virtual visits rather than in-person visits, and that's had to be. But I am interested in the difference in the quality of those virtual visits, because there must be much more that your colleagues can gain from an actual visit to a house and seeing the children in their environment rather than in front of a screen. I just wonder if you could just comment on that, on how you felt that's worked.
So just for clarity, that 80% isn't all virtual visits. That will be a mix because it covers quarter one where we were doing a mix. So we did risk assess all cases and establish those where we needed to carry on visiting, and whether we reduced the frequency and put in a virtual visit in the interim between the real visits. And also we had to take into account if there's anyone in the house shielding, whether anyone was isolating for that period, the welfare of our staff as well in terms of availability of PPE, going back to the early days of lockdown where we we weren't using PPE, or we had very limited supply of it because we were, I suppose, in some ways not wanting to take it away from health colleagues in terms of their access to it. And as that changed, we developed a very clear risk assessment that we would go through before a worker would visit to establish whether the visit was essential or not, and whether PPE was required. And we did have workers going out in full PPE to visit children that we were concerned about during that height of lockdown. But so in the height of lockdown, looking back over the data, I think Stephen, correct me, but showing about 56% of visits were taking place physically, because what you're saying is correct, that what you lose a lot through a visit on a screen or dialogue with a screen. But what some of the feedback has been, especially about looked after children, is that they have really benefited from the increased contact that they've had with their workers over this time, because the contact may be much more frequent because it's on a method or a medium that they actually quite like, over the WhatsApp, or WhatsApp might be outdated now, but the new methods of communicating with them.
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry, I didn't mean to imply that all of the visits were virtual. I do appreciate that some of them were, but you've really explained that well. Thank you very much, and once again, well done for everything that's been done there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, Adam, that the point that quite often when we're looking at the dashboard, we're looking at the timeliness of assessments or visits, whereas obviously the effectiveness of the intervention is the success that we're more interested in.
It's that quality quantity, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very difficult for you to obviously produce data to show that. Abdul, do you have a question?
No, thank you.
Okay, Ken?
Yes, I was actually quite pleased to see this one. I'm interested in particular on the ones where we've gone back to children with plans within 2 years. Look, I must admit, last quarter 2, it was quite worrying when we saw it go up to 24%. We've now got it right down to 3.3%. Well done. I think it's a job well done, definitely, on that one. Thank you very much. But I was wondering what your projection will be for what will happen to that figure over the lockdown.
In terms of repeat plans, as I recall, we did back at looking back at quarter 2 at that time, we did do some audit work looking at that to try and understand what was the cause of that number going up, and it was around whether plans were ending too early for children that were subject to plans. So there's been a lot of work in terms of ensuring that children are on plans for the correct period of time, or until change happens and children are protected. I think the modelling around returns on that, I think that'd be very difficult. I think the top one will be the interesting one in terms of the number of children subject to plans, because it could be that children who weren't referred will now be referred, so they'll come to us later. So in some ways we'll have that overlap of numbers we wouldn't have had if they'd have come when they were referred, if they were referred pre-COVID. I don't know if that sort of makes sense. So that number could increase. But the point that Stephen was making earlier, what I always find amazing when you look at the numbers of the top ones of children subject to plan, is how stable they are, pretty much, how static they seem to be in terms of the variation is very, very marginal.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Thank you. We'll wait and see what happens in quarter 2. Cheers.
Andrew.
Yes, thank you. In the narrative section titled "What action is the service taking?" The final sentence says, "The service continues its so far successful efforts to reduce the need for children to return to a protection plan, be it within 24 months or longer." I'm just wondering if at some point we could have a report on the measures being taken to reduce that need for children to return to a protection plan, including some time series data on the progress being made.
So just for clarity, report on the measures we've taken to prevent children becoming subject to a child protection plan for a second occasion.
Yes. I think that's what you're getting at in the narrative section, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
And that would have been informed by the audit work that was undertaken.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting as well that the service has undertaken quite a few audits of the past few months, just to make sure that we aren't failing any of the children that we have responsibility for over a wide range of aspects. In fact, for quite a while, I felt like I was doing nothing but audit work for the service.
We are talking about a very small number of children, aren't we? We're talking about 3.3% of 132. Is that correct, Stephen?
Yes.
And sibling group size can affect that.
So it could simply be 2 families.
You could have 2
Or
large
even one.
families
Yeah.
that could sway your figures, and I think that's the case with a lot of our numbers in Wokingham, because they're low. The size of a number to start with, that a small variation can create quite a significant percentage change.
Indeed, we have seen that in previous quarters as well. Whereas Adam says, just a couple of big families have had a noticeable impact in the figures.
Yeah. I think my question was more along the lines of, can we actually hear what some of these specific measures are that seem to be having this very positive impact? So just yeah.
Yeah, yes, certainly. I'm sure that would be arranged.
Malcolm.
Yes, my question was very similar to the one which Andy Croy asked, really. It was how many of the visits were virtual as opposed to actual visits. He's answered that by saying there was a mix. The second part, though, the second question there is, when these arrangements are made to visit, how much notice do they get? Are there ever any sort of sudden unannounced visits because you're concerned about something, or do you have to book them 2 weeks in advance and tell them exactly when you're going so that they can prepare or whatever? Are they sudden or long-term notices?
I would say that depends on the situations and the circumstances and the concerns. We do unannounced visits where necessary. Often visits are arranged in advance with the family and the parents.
Yeah, I think it sort of reflects the very tailored approach that the service takes towards the children, that it has a degree of responsibility for, that there will be that mix. Yeah.
Prue, did you have your hand up?
Thank you for that.
I don't think I do.
Okay. Do you have any questions?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Okay. Right, thank you, Stephen. Let's move on to item 5, children in care.
Yes, so marginal increase in the number, but as Adam's pointed out, with the child protection plans, it is quite a stable number throughout the year. Number of children that are in care. The number of visits, the percentage of visits to children in care within timescale has increased slightly, and a very important positive, I think, is the very striking drop that there has been in the percentage of children that have had more than one social worker. Because, of course, it's a turbulent enough experience for children, so it's good to see that we are removing that uncertainty in terms of those that they're dealing with from the service.
Stephen, I just wanted to ask how the overall figure for 2019 to 20 was so low when each quarter was over 66%.
Yes, that
It doesn't look right.
no, it doesn't follow, does it? I'll check that for you. Right, that that's doesn't look right.
Okay, are you ready for questions from members?
Oh, certainly, yes.
Prue.
Thank you. I was going to say it looks like that 1920 figure has been transposed from the Q1 2021, doesn't it?
Mm.
All I had to say really was congratulations on getting it down to 21%, and that is obviously much better for the children, not to have that turnover, provided of course they get on with the social worker that they've got, but which is always, there's always going to be one, isn't there? But no, that is really good progress. Thank you.
Well, again, I think it's in no small part due to the stability that's been established in terms of staff and staffing numbers over the course of the past few quarters, and we're seeing it reflected in performance across the board, but particularly in this this very important indicator.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's really good to see.
Okay, Andy.
Thank you. Yeah, just to reiterate what Prue said, I mean, that's a fantastic improvement. I've got a very quick question on from the text where it's talking about the time you're recording the visits. I think this is the second time in this report that we've mentioned that it's actually the recording of what's going on rather than a change in what's going on, or even a change in the actual spacing of what's going on. So I was just wondering, is it just literally a change in recording what we're doing, or have we changed what we are doing to allow the recording to be easier?
It tends to be a combination of the two.
Okay.
I think we've had this. I think we discussed this before, actually, at a previous meeting, where about how confident are we a visit has taken place, but whether it's the recording that's indicating that's not showing it as having taken place. And we did a lot of work in our performance meeting where we were looking at this to improve that, so that the data reflected the activity rather than and the recording, so that recording is done in a much more timely way, so it gets captured in the data set as well.
Okay.
So it's not an often occurrence that visit doesn't take place unless the family is not present. It's more about getting the recording done in time frames to ensure it's picked up in the data set.
Thank you.
Okay, Abdul.
Thank you, Chair. 21%, excellent. It's very low, so good to hear that. Well done to everyone. Thank you.
Okay, Ken.
No question on this one. That seems fine.
Okay, Andrew.
Yes, thanks. In the minutes of the previous meeting, there's a reference to the new Compass team. How's the new Compass team been doing? And when might it be appropriate to receive some formal feedback on their work? And secondly, the timeliness of visits to children in care seems to be improving. And again, I add my congratulations to everybody who's been involved with that. And I think this and other dashboards show clearly some of the benefits of having fewer social worker vacancies and much greater workforce stability. But are there any factors that we should be aware of that might threaten this going forward?
I'll answer this, Stephen. I think about the Compass team became fully up and running in July. The team manager started towards the end of June and was in post, and so we now have the team manager and then the 4 workers. One's a psychologist and 3 are child and family workers with a very mixed range of experience and skill sets. They have a allocated caseload. We've had meetings with the team managers, and what's interesting is that the wider benefits that we're seeing rather than the initial targeted benefits, which was to the priority is keeping children at home, supporting children in placements to stop those placements breaking down, and where possible returning children from care to home. But some of the other benefits that the team managers were talking about, where when they're jointly allocated, the Compass team, that they're seeing some families where the social workers struggle to engage and communicate, to that becoming much more open, and there's much more engagement, being accepting of visits and accepting of engagement from the social worker. So it's having that positive effect. So the team, we're still quite early days, and if it's something you would like, we could arrange for an update summary of the Compass team for the next meeting, if that's something you would find beneficial.
Yeah, not necessarily the next meeting, but when you consider it appropriate.
Okay, which would give more detail in terms of some of the work they've been undertaking.
Thank you. Yeah.
There was another question you asked, and sorry, I've lost it.
Sorry. Yeah, it's about the benefits of having fewer social worker vacancies and greater workforce stability. But are there any threats going forward that we should be aware of?
I think recruitment is a challenge, that not just for us, for other local authorities as well. I don't think it's been assisted by COVID, where workers may be staying longer in local authorities rather than wanting to move to a local authority where they might be working remotely. To start with, we have had a recent recruitment drive, and we've actually had a number of newly qualified social workers starting. So we've increased our capacity to enable us to have newly qualified social workers in post with those support and line management roles in place to support that, which is a benefit. But we're still advertising to recruit, wanting to move to a more permanent workforce. And I think there's that subtle difference between a stable workforce and a permanent workforce.
Thank you.
Okay, Malcolm.
No questions, but congratulations on the improved figures.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move to item 6, which is care leavers. There you go. We've got a different arrow for us just to show the rates.
Yeah, the variety of arrows that we provide for information, yes. So this arrow indicates there has been little or no change between quarters, and as you can see, we've gone from 91.8% to 91%. So Wokingham does seem to be rather good at maintaining a connection with care leavers after they have left care, and the figures you can see is quite a positive one. There has been a slight increase in the percentage of care leavers that are NEET since the previous quarter, but given the economic situation, I think that's only to be expected, and we'll probably see that increase further next quarter as the full impact once the lockdown is completely ended. But it is interesting to note, I think, that despite the fact that we have had an increase in NEET care leavers, it's still lower than it was at the same time last year, which I think is a noteworthy positive. And the percentage of care leavers in suitable accommodation has increased noticeably over last quarter as well. I should probably mention at this stage that there was a request at the last meeting for actual figures as opposed to percentages in regards to care leavers and their accommodation. I'm more than happy to provide that for members if they're interested.
To give us some context, Stephen, how many care leavers aged 18 to 24 do we have?
At present, we have. Sorry, I've just lost the document.
Is it 72?
I'm feeling all the 72. Yes, I'm feeling all the technological fun. It's 72 this quarter. And of those care leavers, 5 are not in suitable accommodation.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. I think if the report could always just state how many care leavers, then members are able to, then work things out for themselves from that to see whether we're talking about very small numbers or larger ones.
Yes, well, I made a note of that targets and figures would be beneficial. So certainly we can include those in the reports going forward.
Right, let's see if the members have got questions for you today. I'm going to start with Malcolm.
Nothing at the moment, sorry.
Okay, Andrew.
Yes, I'd like to pick up on a couple of the things that Stephen has said. Firstly, looking at care leavers and accommodation, I'm a little bit puzzled because we've just been told that there are currently 72 care leavers, but 5 of the 72 are still in unsuitable accommodation. Now that's not 97%, which is the figure that appears in the table. So some clarification there, if possible. Are mental health issues sometimes a driver to ending up in unsuitable accommodation? And given the impact of the pandemic on mental health, is this something to be concerned about going forward? Stephen, you said that you believe that there could well be an increase in NEET in the coming quarters. Are there any additional measures being put in place to help these young people? Thank you.
Well, if I can take the last question first. Yes, I believe so. I think Sal was discussing this earlier today, actually, that the steps are being taken to address that because we do expect it to increase, and perhaps he might like to give a bit more insight into what is being planned in that respect. In terms of the figure, I'm loath to correct Adam, but it was 72 for Q4 of last year. It is 88 for this quarter.
Thank you, Stephen.
But and as I say, yes, there are 5 in unsuitable accommodation this quarter out of the 88.
If I
That's
may,
still not 97%.
That probably is reflected in the fact that this is an ever-changing situation. So at the time of actually producing the report, there would have been 5 in unsuitable accommodation. That's changed since the figure of 97% there's a certain flux, on a regular basis in terms of where these care leavers are and what they're doing.
So but we've got two unknown, haven't we? So that means it's 7 of the 88. So 81 are in suitable accommodation. Is that right?
Let me see. So we have 2 in bed and breakfast accommodation at present, 2 in custody, and 1 sofa surfer. And then there's 2 that are known.
I think it's important to add that the unsuitable accommodation is something that the service or the team is very conscious of, and some of those might be young people who are out of borough and we're struggling to get them housing in the local authority where they're residing, or they've been offered accommodation, they haven't accepted it. And then custody counts as non-suitable accommodation as well, which would be beyond our control in terms of them being detained.
Yes, in fact, one of those 5 unsuitable is currently in the borough but wants to live in Slough and is on the waiting list for housing there. But of course, as an out of borough individual, is not on the priority list. So.
Andrew, did you have another question?
Yeah, there was the question about whether mental health issues, are sometimes a driver into unsuitable accommodation, and give the widespread reporting, of growing mental health concerns amongst youngsters. Is this something that we should be concerned about going forward?
I think it's fair to say that we're always very conscious for our looked after children and our care leavers about their emotional well-being and mental health, and how we work with our colleagues in health around supporting that and addressing that. I think with those, whether there was a linkage to that and unsuitable accommodation, I wouldn't make that connection here in terms of that. But I think it's something we're very conscious of moving forward across all cohorts of children, actually, in terms of the potential impact of the strange times we've been through recently.
Mm. And certainly, I'm aware that schools are acutely aware of the mental health impact of the current situation and lockdown, what have you, and are keeping a close eye on that as well.
Okay, thank you.
So, Malcolm, did you have your hand up? Did you want to come up on something?
Yes, I do. A couple of questions arose afterwards. You've got these numbers for people in care, and then you mentioned, for instance, somebody might be in custody and so on. If someone's in custody, I don't know how long they can be kept in custody, but if they're in custody for an extended period, do they still count as if they're in care, even though presumably you can't go and visit them at a normal, accommodation or whatever? Are they still counted in care? And the second half of that same question is, if they just do a runner, they don't tell you and they disappear, do you just knock them off the care leavers list and say, we don't know, or do you leave them on and say you're pursuing them, or what? What's the status?
So this data set here is all care leavers, so would tend to be 18 plus.
Right.
So there's a situation, if you become remanded in custody, you become looked after automatically. So if a 15-year-old gets remanded, 16-year-old gets remanded to custody, they become looked after. After a period of 13 weeks, if they're still remanded, they will then have access, if they've been there over their 16th birthday, to a care leaving services when they reach 18, and they will be considered a care leaver. And their looked after status will end when the remand ends and they are sentenced. They might be on remand for 20 weeks over their 16th birthday, will there become looked after child, and they will have rights as a care leaver, and therefore we have duties to provide those services to them. So you might have some young people who are detained and they maintain that. And as a care leaver in custody, an 18 plus in custody, we would still have an ongoing relationship and role, and we would still communicate and visit them and keep those open as care leavers, because we'd have that ongoing role and service to them and duty. In terms of people going missing, we will keep, if someone goes missing or underground, and we will keep that case open, and we will continue to make communicating with the police to try and locate them, because it's around holding them in mind and being that corporate parent and trying to locate that person wherever they may be, and that responsibility doesn't cease. We'll get to a point where they're 21, where we will then look at closing that case because they've reached that and the statutory duty ceases, although it can go to 25 if the young person requests it. But if they're missing, they won't have made that request, and we will make a decision at that point whether we close that case or not.
Okay, so they remain on the list until the last possible moment. You don't say because we haven't seen them for several weeks and we don't know where they are. They still stay on the list, but the status changes.
I think the status doesn't change. It's around what any good parent would do for their child who was missing.
Current status, I meant really,
yeah.
Where they are at any one time.
And you would carry on, I suppose, engaging with the police and the agencies to try and locate that person to ensure they're
safe.
Well,
yeah.
Safe, yeah.
Okay, thank you for that.
Okay, Ken, do you have a question?
No, thank you, Chair, on this one.
Okay, Abdul?
Chair, thank you.
Andy Croy?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a question on the national context and the percentage of care leavers who are NEET. And I'm wondering why we are in line with the national averages when we have one of the most prosperous and dynamic parts of the country in terms of the economy, and why we aren't actually doing much better than the national average in terms of getting care leavers into employment.
Go ahead, Sam.
If I may, I think there are a number of reasons for that. As Adam has said, some of our care leavers reside out of Wokingham, and therefore are subject to the nature of those local economies. One of the things that we also know in Wokingham in respect of our general NEET population is that we have a relatively low take-up of things such as apprenticeships, which would be the types of, or for some care leavers, would be the appropriate type of approach in terms of engaging them in employment and training. So I suppose it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of the availability of employment opportunities within the borough, the type of employment opportunities within the borough, which would then mirror for care leavers and our other post-16, post-18 populations. But with care leavers, it can be exacerbated by the fact that some of them live outside of Wokingham Borough and therefore are trying to access employment activities in those areas. By virtue of being Wokingham care leavers, we still track them in terms of NEET outcomes.
Mm. And if I can come back, when you say our care leavers are less likely to take up are less likely to take up apprenticeships, is that because of the nature of the apprenticeships which are available locally, or the quantity, or is there something about our care leavers and apprenticeships?
If I can, I don't think that that's something that is confined to care leavers. Across the borough, we are trying to work with employers to increase the level of apprenticeships that are available and the range of apprenticeships that are available, so that young people can go into opportunities that meet their needs. Because one of the things is it's easy to go into a job or a college course because it's there, but actually if very quickly you're not getting the value out of it for yourself, that's where, for example, we do see high dropout rates from colleges and those sorts of things. So it's about having the right mix of opportunities available as well as the volume of them.
And just to add that the government does have a scheme of ring-fenced apprenticeships for care leavers that we do get information about, and we do publicise with our cohorts of young people with their workers to support them in the applying to the civil service.
Thank you.
Prue, do you have a question?
No, an observation really, which is I think this problem with apprenticeships is wider than just care leavers, and it's something to do with the way I think, particularly maybe in an area like this, we are set up with an expectation that people do more academic things, university or further education and things in a different way, and we're not so good at thinking about manual skills, for example, and I don't think it's just a neat thing, but I think otherwise my questions were going to be about the neat bit, and I think they've all been answered. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Prue. Yeah, I think at a meeting of this committee last year, we pointed out that in Woking Borough we had more young people who were NEETs than who were in apprenticeships, which shocked all of us. And we had asked if we could revisit looking at apprenticeships. I think that might be on the forward plan for the end of next year. I'm surprised we don't have more apprenticeships around here because of the higher level apprenticeships that are offered at places like Thames Valley Park by Microsoft, Oracle, etc. I can only imagine that there's very high competition for those apprenticeships. So perhaps it's just the fact that apprenticeships in our borough are not always taken up by young people who live in our borough. Can I also ask Adam, NEETs, that would include our young care leavers who've become parents at a young age?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Right, thank you. Let's move on to item 7, children missing from home or from care.
Yes, another positive indicator for this quarter. So as you can see, that the number of children missing from home or care is continuing to decrease. The return home interviews is increasing.
Stephen, I think we did ask at previous meetings that we would like to know how many children went missing from their family home and how many children went missing from care. And we seem to have a combined figure again.
Right. Well, I shall address that for the next meeting if that's agreeable to members. And finally, then, of course, the number of children missing from education has decreased slightly. And we are, of course, the figure does reflect the fact that children have not been in school for a period, but this is not a truancy figure. It does reflect those not engaging with the school system.
Yeah, I'm quite surprised you've got a figure at all, really, for Q1 of this year, since school registers weren't being kept. Where would the figure of 3 have come from? Sal?
This relates to children that are absent from school roles. So the national definition is those children that are not on a school role nor being educated within alternative provision. So therefore, even during lockdown, the majority of children, even though they weren't attending, will have been on the school roll. But there will also be 3 children that have been identified in Q1 that were not on a school roll and were not attending alternative provision and had been in that space for some time, which is why you'll have that number of 3.
Okay. Members, Malcolm. Oh, sorry. I'll start with Prue this time, so you were last before.
Okay.
Prue.
Thank you. Quite naively, I sort of thought that in Q1 we might have been in lockdown, and then I'm slightly surprised to see there are any children who managed to go missing. Can you explain a bit more about how that might happen? How does it happen that in a period where everybody's supposed to be at home, that there they are escaping all over the place in almost the same numbers as normal? That's a bit of a, perhaps too light-hearted a way to say it, but I don't really understand. Is it the home circumstances or the things or the style of the family that means they don't actually keep tabs on the children, or is it difficult children in foster care who don't pay any attention to things like lockdown, or is there any common themes that you can think of?
Well, I presume, and perhaps Adam or Sal can chip in if I'm wrong on this, but the factors that would motivate children to go missing from care or from their home circumstances will not have changed because of lockdown being enforced.
I think what also one of the other challenges of missing during lockdown was the potential consequences were more significant for children who may have left a placement and therefore could not return to that placement because in some ways they breached the bubble of that placement, especially where there was someone who was shielding or isolating. So we did have situations where we had to identify new placements following an episode of missing.
Okay, Andy.
I have no questions on this, Chair.
Abdul?
Thank you, Alison. I'm finding it a bit difficult to understand when all the greens seem to be green when children are missing. So I wonder, what does green mean in that sense?
It's the numbers have reduced from the previous time.
Yes, so we're not suggesting that children going missing is a positive, just that the number that are going missing is decreasing, which of course is a good thing.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Abdul. Ken?
No, nothing on this one, Alison. Thank you.
Andrew?
Yes. In light of the clarification of exactly what that phrase children missing from education means, I'm just wondering whether in future iterations of this dashboard, whether we could actually change that to say not on a school roll or in alternative provision. And I think that would certainly be a useful sort of clarification reminder to myself. I do have another question sort of request. I see in the forward plan that we'll receive a report on the issue of child exploitation in our January meeting. Now, I don't want to preempt that report, but could I ask that it include some fairly careful consideration of just how robust the intelligence is related to this, and specifically, what's the likelihood that instances of child exploitation are going undetected? So if that could be taken into consideration when we receive that report, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Sal?
Sorry, Chair, I was just going to respond to Councillor McIntyre's first point, that children missing from education is the national term. But I would suggest that we can add something in brackets to give it that definition rather than change the title, so that we can cross-reference it against national points if we needed to.
Certainly, even just in the again in the narrative, I'm more than happy that we can include a reference to that there, just for clarification. That would be useful.
So, Sal, is it fair? Is it quite likely that the same children are being counted each quarter for children missing from education?
It's unlikely that it will be the same children, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility. Of course, I can go through with colleagues and draw some of that detail out. Generally speaking, when we do identify children that are missing education, we work with parents to ensure that they come back into education through our education welfare service, and can use things like school attendance orders to require children to attend education. So it's unlikely that they are the same children from quarter to quarter, but I will double check.
So does this cover children from traveller families who may attend a school for a term and then, you know, they leave the area with their family?
If the children are removed from roll and move elsewhere and therefore become on roll at another school elsewhere, then they would not be deemed as missing education. So if they've physically left the school and told the school that they are leaving the school because they are moving to another area, then that wouldn't be a child missing education.
But if they were just, you know, hitting the road, so they weren't, they didn't necessarily know where they were going next.
Yeah, so in those circumstances, that could fit, but it can also apply to other children that may, for example, move into the area mid-term and haven't yet looked for or requested a place at a school. So those sorts of things can happen, and in which case our school admissions team will work with families to expedite getting their children into school. So it can be for a range of reasons.
Okay, thank you very much. Malcolm, did you have a question?
Yes, a couple of quick questions. It's about the mechanics of it, or the process, if you like. If you get a child who, whether it's at home or in care, if he either says, I've had enough of this and tells people I'm off, he disappears, or maybe even leaves a note with people saying, I'm off up to London, maybe see you at some time or not. He disappears. Obviously, presumably at some point, the police would be involved because it's a missing person when you're a missing child. I'm not interested in going through that process in depth at the moment, but they count it as missing. If they come back in 4 or 5 months or so and knock on the door and say, I've come back, didn't work up there, what happens? Do we say, oh, we're glad you're back, and we put them back on the list where they were? Or is there an investigation of where they went and what they did to make sure that child exploitation hasn't been done? How strong is the checking of them if they come back after a big gap?
So the category of missing is a police definition that's applied. So previously there used to be a category of absent. So if a child was somewhere you knew they were, they might be categorised as absent, but that's no longer an option. So if a child's not where they're meant to be for a known period and there's concerns and the police make the decision that child's missing, that's the category it's given. If a child leaves our care and goes missing for 4 months, they will still remain looked after, and our court preparing duties and our duties that child will remain throughout. So we'll have strategy meetings, we'll have regular meetings with the police around trying to identify their location. It may be we advertise, it may be we go to the media, it may be the police may ping their mobile to establish their location. All sorts of investigations will go on to try and locate that child. And when they return, if that placement is still available, they will return to that placement where possible. But their status won't have changed during that period of them being missing.
And what sort of checking will be done to see where they went or what they did?
So if you look at
being exploited there.
The second data set on their return home interviews carried out on time. So return home interviews is an activity that takes place where a worker goes and meets and interviews the young person to try and establish where they've been during that time, whether they've been missing for 6 hours, 7 hours, 1 day, overnight. That's the return interview will take place. And also that child will have an allocated social worker, because often young people don't just disclose where they've been, and it's a process of trust and building up and trying to build the puzzle really about where a child may have been, in terms of whether they've been exploited or what was occurring during that period of time. But it's very unusual for us to have children missing for that period of time. The cohort of children that do go missing, or I would say more likely to go missing, is unaccompanied asylum-seeking children where they've arrived and been looked after by a local authority, and it may be linked to the original reason that they came to the UK or how they got to the UK, that they may go missing early on in the state following their arrival.
And a previous answer just triggered another one. If they say we're moving and going to another school, or they run off or whatever, you don't always get told where they're going or which other school they're going to. So you can't trail them and track them in that respect, can you? So if they just if the parents leave a note or phone up and say we moved off, he's going to another school, you can't track that to see where they're going or which school. And there's no obligation for anyone to report back, is there? It just becomes an open-ended.
Is this for a looked after child?
Yeah, well, in care, yes.
If the child's in care, then we will have a role of a court parenting role where it depends on their status of being looked after as well, whether they're in our care on a voluntary basis under Section 20, whether we have a care order. Because if we have a care order, we have parental responsibility, whereas on a voluntary arrangement, we don't. So if a family want to remove their child from care, the only way we can prevent that is by making an application to the court to obtain PR under a care order.
Right. So if they say we're going to move and he's going to another school, there's nothing you can do about that. Not unless you
I don't think that's. I wouldn't agree with that statement. I would say we would consider the potential impact on that child's welfare and whether we need to, as a local authority, intervene to promote that child's welfare and safety.
Okay.
And these become the very on balance, difficult situations we get involved in terms of state intervention in family lives, and when we do and don't do that.
It's very complex, isn't it? Yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, let's move to the last one. Dashboard item 8, Children's Services Workforce, where we've already talked about the impact of being able to retain and employ social workers.
Well, yes. I mean, I don't really have much more to add on that beyond what we have discussed already. Is that it has become increasingly stable. Yes, there has been a slight increase in turnover since the previous quarter, but nonetheless, I think the rest of the indicators do show that we have a much more stable workforce, and it is reaping rewards as a result.
All right. Abdul, have you got a question? I can see your hands up.
Oh, thank you, Alison. It was related to the previous question. Do we have any BME or asylum seekers in our authority? BME group, any?
Do we have a cohort population within Wokingham, or do we have a cohort looked after?
Care leavers or children in care?
Children in care, my question is.
Yes.
Okay. Any percentage or?
I couldn't give you the percentage offhand in relation to that.
I might be able to give you a moment just to check.
I think we just need to be cautious about numbers of.
Okay. Okay, that's fine then. Thank you.
Do you want to take that offline, Abdul, and perhaps Adam could email you some information?
Yeah.
That would be great if you don't mind. Yeah.
Okay, let's carry on with dashboard 8, looking at the workforce. So Abdul, you didn't have a question on that, did you? No? So I'll go to Andrew.
No, I think most of my questions on the workforce have been answered tonight. Thank you.
Andy.
Thank you. I mean, I was wondering, I think as you said, that the other indicators are showing there's increased recruitment and fewer vacancies. And we saw quite a big change in some of the KPIs as a result of those changes. So I'm just trying to reconcile that sense of movement and this data here, which doesn't show much movement. So is it a mixed thing? Were the vacancies that filled, were they a small proportion of the total covered by this KPI? I just don't understand why they seem to be saying not quite the same thing.
I think the other complicating factor to take into account is here that the number of posts has increased within the service. So as part of our growth, we did have a growth in roles and worker posts following April, and they would have been recruited to over the year. And where necessary, we may have had locums or interims in those posts if there was a service demand.
Yes, do bear in mind this is a rolling figure. So as Adam points out, as there's a change in the number of posts that the service has open, then that will be reflected in the number of qualified social workers that are either coming into the service or leaving it.
Okay.
Ken.
Thank you.
No, nothing on this one, thank you.
Malcolm.
No questions on this, thank you.
And Prue.
I think everything that we need to know about that has been covered by earlier items. Thank you.
So Adam, have we had more stability 2019 to 2020 in our leadership team in children's services?
Yeah, I would say that across the board we have. So within my part of the service, we in the leadership, we only have one interim senior manager, and then across the board team managers and ATMs, we have a high majority are permanent. And I think it comes back to the point I was making earlier, the difference between stability and permanence, in that it's trying where you need to rely on locums. What you don't want to do is have a churn in locums. You want to keep the same ones where possible, in terms of providing that consistency, because we will always have a percentage need for locums to fill those short-term vacancies or maternity cover or long-term sickness, so forth. And it's trying to get that number down, reducing that number to what would be an appropriate percentage of our total staffing cohort. But I would say across the board in leadership, I would say there's been much more stability, or there is stability.
Yeah, I think that's certainly contributed to, the workforce remaining more stable. So thank you very much for that. Members, are we happy to, I think I've almost forgotten the word now. Do we simply note this, Lucianne?
I'll have to have a look at what the recommendation.
No, I found it. That the children's services performance indicators are noted. Can everybody raise their hand? Excellent. So that's done, and we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the school performance indicators. Is Gillian here?
Yes, I'm still here, Alison.
Good. Right, so has everybody received, it was sent in a separate email, and we were going to briefly, really, I think, members, let Gillian just go over what's of significance now about the 2019 exam results, because Gillian was all prepared to discuss those with us at the March meeting, which had to be cancelled. So can we start with that, please, Gillian?
Yep, sure. I'll just So if we look at the 2019 outcomes, obviously that's a year ago now, but circumstances have got in the way of us being able to discuss that. In the majority of indicators, the borough schools performed above the national indicators. So if we looked at Key Stage 4, the GCSEs, for attainment 8 and average progress 8 scores, those were both above the national average last year.
Do you want to just remind us which page number you're looking at? So we're all.
So this is the March report on page 1. So if colleagues have the March report up, did you want me to share it, Alison? Would that be helpful?
Well, only if there's something very significant, because I think it's about what's significant to us now that we learned from, because this year,
okay,
I'll just have any results.
I'll just talk you through it then. So if I just give you the summary, the indicators were that at the headline levels, outcomes for students across the borough at Key Stage 4 were above national indicators. And for those children who did A levels, there was an increase in outcomes for those children as well. When we looked at the A, B or better results, which is one of the standard measures. So children at Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 in 2019 outperformed the national average. If we look at what was happening in 2019 in relation to Key Stage 1, we've got a number of indicators. So early years foundation stage, Overall, was doing well in comparison with the national average. I also submitted you some data around the difference between boys and girls, and that gap was decreasing for the early years foundation stage outcomes. For children who were eligible for free school meals at early years foundation stage, that gap widened slightly in 2019. It had reduced in 2018, but has increased again slightly in 2019. In terms of the phonics screening test, which is the year 1 test, the gap between boys and girls was in line with the national average, and our results were above national average. And if we look at children who are eligible for free school meals, this was an area where we'd really made a significant improvement in 2018, but the gap changed for those children negatively in 2019. So the gap widened again in 2019. And what we saw was across the piece, in Key Stage 1 and 2, some increase in outcomes for children who are not eligible for free school meals, and a decrease for children who were eligible for free school meals, meaning that that gap actually opened up further. So if we look at Key Stage 1, reading, writing and maths, in 2019, for reading, we exceeded the national average, and the gap between boys and girls was lower than the national average. In writing, the same situation, exceeded national average, and the gap between boys and girls was lower than the national average. In maths, the same situation again. In fact, we had equity of attainment in maths between boys and girls. So there was actually no gap in maths. When we look at Key Stage 1 in terms of our most vulnerable children and those eligible for free school meals, we had a decrease in the gap for, oh, it's cut off the top of the, that's clever, it's cut off the top on your document. A decrease in the gap for reading, a decrease in the gap for writing, which was the same as the national average, and a decrease in the gap for maths at Key Stage 1. So a really good news story around those free school meal children at Key Stage 1 and being able to make some gains on closing the gap. In terms of Key Stage 2, if we just look across the board, the reading test, the borough performed above average, above the national average, and our gap between boys and girls was lower than the national average. In terms of grammar, punctuation and spelling, we achieved above the national average, and our gap between boys and girls was lower than the national average. The same was true of the maths, where again, another good news story in terms of differential between boys and girls, there was no differential between boys and girls' performance in maths. So the work that's been going on in borough schools really paying off in terms of outcomes for children in maths at Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. In terms of writing at Key Stage 2, again, above national average and slightly up on 2018 scores, and our gap between boys and girls below the national average. When we come to look at that at Key Stage 2, for those children eligible for free school meals, in reading, our gap between the attainment of our children not eligible for free school meals and those who are eligible for free school meals had decreased, but was still above the national average. The same happened for the grammar, punctuation and spelling test. Similarly for the maths, and also for the writing. So we made ground across the piece, but our gap still remains above the national average. So that's a continued focus at the end of Key Stage 2. And then at the end of the report, I know Councillor Hellier-Simmons had asked in particular for some information around schools out of the borough that our pupils attend. So I had just added the publicly available information for Yatesley, which shows them as achieving in average range for schools nationally in 2019, and the information for Edgebarrow, indicating that they performed above average in the national range for 2019.
Okay.
So is there anything else?
Members, do you just want to speak up? You've got a question about the 2019 results.
Yes, please. May I speak?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Gillian, you identified a widening of some of the gaps between disadvantaged pupils and their peers. Now, the report acknowledges that diminishing differences between outcomes for disadvantaged pupils and their peers is a particular challenge in areas like ours that are relatively wealthy and have comparatively low numbers of disadvantaged pupils. Now, I've got 3 questions which I'd like to ask, if I may, and I'd like to ask each of them separately. So much of the analysis provided focuses on comparisons against national averages, and that's what I would expect in a report like this. But averages within any school can often mask very wide ranges in performance, the so-called outliers. Anecdotally, I think we've all heard reports of schools focusing a lot of effort on pupils whose grades hover around the average, for example, to stop the C's from becoming the D's, with all the implications that that may have or be perceived to have for the schools. Is there any monitoring of the performance of the outlier pupils, including the outstandingly able pupils and those who consistently earn the very lowest grades? That's the first question.
Okay, shall we deal with them one at a time? It's probably the simplest thing to do. So I think there's quite a lot wrapped up in the answer to that one. In terms of where schools are challenging their own particular cohorts, there is a national requirement that schools are held accountable for the pupil premium funding that they receive. And we work closely with sharing best practice with all of our schools in terms of how they account for that funding. And part of that involves them demonstrating the expenditure on what they've done to move children forward in terms of progress for every child who's eligible for that funding, which is all of these children in that free school meals group. So to pick up your question about, is there an over focus around those who are just on that borderline, get it, not get it grade? The focus on looking at the accountability of that funding stream prevents that from being a focus. And it causes schools to have to look at the full range of attainment of pupils. One of the things that we are focused on challenging schools around is making sure that we are challenging right across that spectrum of ability. So we are asking the questions about what is happening for a group of pupils who we would identify potentially as being our double disadvantaged pupils, who are eligible for pupil premium, but are also recognised as having a special educational need. So we would term those as being double disadvantaged, and it's a conversation that we've been having with Ofsted and HMI about the performance of our double disadvantaged group, and what is it that are the specific barriers in terms of socio and economic issues that relate to the pupil premium grant and free school meal issues, and what are the specific issues for that child relating to education need that relate to their specific educational needs as identified by their SEN provision. So there's quite a bit of complexity at times if we're looking at that end of the spectrum. And then we are also challenging schools around our high retaining free school meal children to make sure that they also have equity of access to that funding and aren't neglected because they are high performers in the first place. So does that take you towards an answer to that one?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay.
Could I ask the second question? The second and third questions are much shorter, so I could perhaps combine them. Have there been any attempts to identify best practice in local authorities with similar socio-economic profiles to Wokingham to help diminish these differences between the disadvantaged pupils and their peers? And then finally, when identifying disadvantage in order to target supports, and I was really interested in what you just said about doubly disadvantaged pupils, are other factors besides family income and special educational needs, are there other factors that could or should be considered, such as having vulnerable adults in the household or households in which English is not routinely spoken? Could they also be factors?
Okay, so if I look at the best practice question first, in terms of best practice, yes, the simple answer is yes, a lot of work is undertaken in terms of understanding what best practice looks like. My colleague in our team who focuses her work on narrowing the gap and attainment for and achievement for our most vulnerable pupils is actually part of a pan-Berkshire wide group of officers who run a network of activity, sharing practice across Berkshire, which also enables us to run training sessions and network meetings for our staff in our schools across the region, and sharing practice and enabling us to attract a wider range of speakers to come. So, it gives us economies of scale to be able to engage with national speakers. So if I just give you one example of something that's come from that working, we tend to have a biannual conference focused on pupil premium children across the Pan-Berks region. At our 2 years ago, we had colleagues from Voice 21, which is an organisation that runs out of School 21, a free school in the East End of London, whose curriculum is based on an oracy model and is focused on developing oral language for children. Because a lot of the research tells us that if children have not been exposed to enough language early on, they arrive in school with a language deficit, which means that the curriculum becomes more difficult to access. So what we're looking at is kind of plugging that language deficit. Now, as a result of that presentation at that conference 2 years ago, the Pan-Berks group actually managed to persuade Voice 21 to run one of their national programmes at a local level across Berkshire. Was something that they'd never done before. And we have a Pan-Berks Voice 21 project running that's now into its third year now of working with schools.
So we can combine together and see in which ward in our area are those deprivation children are, which school it is. At the moment, we don't know where they are. Did you hear?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how we could do that.
Can we go by ward or particular by school? Say, for example, Bulmesh, example in Woodley.
Does that data appear in the Berkshire Observatory? I suspect it might.
I've certainly seen sources that gives all that information by wards.
Yeah, it's about what information within it you want in a kind of, we're looking at in relation to attainment profile as well. So
I don't think, Gillian, you're going to be able to give this committee attainment broken down by wards, and that's not what we're here to do. As overview and scrutiny, none of us should be thinking of our ward. We're always thinking about all of our children across the borough. Can we keep moving? I'm just conscious that it's 9 o'clock. We've still got quite a lot to talk about.
Okay. Thank you.
Prue, did you have a question?
Yes, no, that was very, very interesting, Gillian, and thank you, Andrew, for thinking of the questions. The pick up Abdul's point about ethnicity. At what level of granularity do you go down to in ethnic groupings? And are there any particular ethnic groups that appear to be struggling compared to others?
So we use the DFE census groupings that parents are asked to ascribe to when they enter school, and those are uploaded via the school census on an annual basis, and then we tune into those. One of the difficulties that we have is that we don't always have on a per school basis, a significant number of children in each of those groups to be statistically viable. So we have to be very cautious about what the data might be telling us at a school by school level, and at times as to what the data might be telling us at a borough level. One of the things that we do know in terms of our categorisation, if we look at that ethnicity list, is that our mixed white, black, Caribbean group don't always perform as well as their peers.
Thank you.
Sorry, Pri, you're on mute.
I took it off and I clicked too hard and it went on again. It has to happen at least once a meeting. Have you got any sort of plans or extra support or guidance for schools to help address that particular problem in that particular ethnic mix of pupils?
Yes, so it often comes down to an individual response because in each school we are usually looking at individual children. So it's about working with that family and working with that individual pupil.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, members, any other questions for Gillian before we move on? Prue, you've muted. Okay, that's fine. Right, okay, carry on, Gillian.
So should we move into the report for this meeting?
Yes, please.
Okay. So let's just get the right report up. So many reports open for this one. School performance, there we go. So this is quite an interesting time in which to be reporting back to you on schools performance and Ofsted report. First of all, to say that we continue to be in an Ofsted suspension. So there are no inspections happening at the present time. And that has been confirmed right the way through now until the end of the autumn term. What we do have, though, is a slightly different engagement with HMI and Ofsted during this term. And Ofsted will be conducting a series of conversations with schools, which they are calling survey visits, in order to understand and record the impact of the pandemic. And in the report, I've outlined the 5 key areas that will be the lines of inquiry for what Ofsted are calling will be a conversation with senior leaders in schools. And they're particularly looking at picking up the barriers that schools have faced during the pandemic and how they've managed to return to school this term. Looking at how the curriculum has been modified to ensure that children are making good catch-up, and what plans are for remote education, should there be a requirement for any form of remote education to continue going forward. Looking at how children are settling back into school and how they're getting on with their learning and they're addressing any behavioural needs. And linked to that, picking up any emotional and health and well-being issues for children, and looking at whether there is a requirement for any further support to be provided for schools in that area. And then finally, as always, a continued focus on safeguarding. These survey visits are going to be written up as a letter. There will be no judgment, so it will just be a record of the conversation that's happened. And it will enable Ofsted to be able to report nationally on the impact of the pandemic and what good practice has looked like in schools during the autumn term. So I was just going to pause there, and I don't know whether there was any questions about the Ofsted element before I talk about the exam and the outcome element.
Could I ask a question, please?
Yes, do.
Ofsted's describing these as survey visits, as conversations with schools, and I think that's entirely appropriate. I think it's also really appropriate that at this time no written judgments, are going to be recorded. But I really, really do hope that Ofsted inspectors will still be very sensitive, to the anxiety that schools will have in what they will perceive, to be an Ofsted, and in reality will be an Ofsted visit, albeit, under a different format. Have any of the schools, either before the holidays or in the last week or so, raised any new COVID-related matters for concern that they worry might impact on school progress and how Ofsted might perceive how the school has been coping with these changed circumstances?
Nobody's raised any concerns about Ofsted view of how our school community are responding to the pandemic and the risk assessments and the provision that they've got in place. Certainly, I had all the heads on a call this morning, and nobody was expressing any concerns about, well, what are Ofsted going to say about X, Y, and Z? And I think in some respects that's because we've been very clear with schools about them being the owner of their decisions around their risk assessments, and being clear that they need to be comfortable with what they're doing and focused on the catch up and the provision for children. And I think because they're focused in that way, at the present time, nobody's raised any queries around an anxiety about Ofsted. That's not to say that colleagues might not feel a little greater anxiety should they receive a call to say that they're going to have a conversation. Ofsted equally have been very clear about there is no expectation that schools produce any further paperwork or evidence for these conversations. So it really is focused on being a conversation. And kind of as supplementary information to that, we do know that Ofsted invited schools to invite Ofsted to come for a conversation. And we do know that we've had at least one school within the borough who have taken up that opportunity and said that they would welcome the opportunity to have that conversation. So actually we see some of our schools being quite proactive in this response to the surveying. And the other thing is that the focus of the school improvement team's work during this term will be linked to those Ofsted conversation topics. So we've been very clear with schools that our conversations with them will help them should they have any conversation with Ofsted in the coming months.
Thank you very much.
If there aren't any other questions, shall I move on to the next section?
Your next section being?
What's happening with performance indicators, exams and results?
Yes, please. And I would also like Sal to give us a bit of an update on what happened during the summer with the results for the young people at our schools and the impact on them. And how the relationship with schools is going forward, and to talk about all the lessons that have been learnt from remote learning, because given the possibility of a second wave, and having to close schools again and get returned to remote learning, just to highlight how the council was supporting schools and will be doing that again.
Absolutely. I think Gillian might touch on some of that in terms of what she's about to go through in terms of the school performance indicators section, but I'm more than happy once Gillian's finished to provide you with a bit of further updates if you need it, if that's okay, Councillor Sorrell.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Sal. Go ahead, Gillian.
Okay, so you will have noticed, colleagues, that there is no data in this section of the report, and that's because, as we indicated last time we met, that the DfE have removed all the testing requirements in terms of reportable statutory outcomes at primary phase for the year 2020 even. So no reportable early years foundation stage baseline screening, no reportable phonics screening, or year 2 SATs or year 6 SATs. So none of those were reported during the summer term. And so there is no national data set, and there are no school data sets either for those. There has been a recent announcement in the last few weeks that children in last year's year 1 cohort, so current year 2 cohort, who would have undertaken the phonics screening test during the middle part of last year, will now be expected not to undertake a current test, but to experience a past paper during the second part of this term. And those any children who, on taking that past paper, don't meet the expected standard will be asked to be entered for the year 2 retake in summer 2021. So children who don't meet the standard for year 1 at the second half of this term in a as yet not reportable form will be asked to take the year 2 check in summer 2021, which at the moment we're not clear whether will be reportable, but we suspect it will be because it will be in that 2021 exam loop, which is going to be reportable. So that's kind of where we are with Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. In terms of Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5, GCSE and A levels and vocational qualifications, the original plan was that there was going to be a process where schools would look at the evidence base that they had for each student based on assessment, modules of work completed, ongoing coursework and any mocks that had been taken, and put an overall grade for a child, and then to undertake a ranking process of all of those grades, which would then potentially lead to what we normally see in exam results is a normal curve of distribution. And to submit that to the exam boards, who were then going to apply their algorithms to come up with a formulated version of a result for each child. That algorithm was also going to take into account prior attainment in the school, so looking at the last 3 years worth of results for the school, and to give some kind of smoothing effect to that, so that the results for 2020 wouldn't be outlying results from the historical trend of results that the school would have had either at GCSE or at A level. And colleagues, you will be aware that there was some change of heart on a number of days as those exam days came closer or even had passed by the government as to what was then going to be accepted as the final grade for each pupil. What we have ended up with is a situation where the centre assessed grades are the ones that pupils are able to take away. Centre assessed grades means those ones that the school, in our case, submitted for each child. So they can use those, and they can use the algorithm generated exam result that they were given on results day. There is an opportunity for students who are unhappy with those outcomes to take an examination. It's being termed a resit, but given that they didn't take an exam in the first place, it's challenging to call it a resit, but that's how it's being badged. So they can do a resit examination during the autumn term exam round, and that would be in October and November for A-levels and then GCSEs. For all schools, that information has not been collected nationally. So the DfE are not using that information for performance tables. So the performance tables are suspended, and no data from the 2020 outcomes at Key Stage 4 or Key Stage 5 will be used to judge school performance. So there will be no analysed school performance data or reports issued by the DfE, and no local statistics for 2020 will be available, either at Key Stage 4 or Key Stage 5, and equally for any of those indicators that I've talked about previously at Key Stage 1 or Key Stage 2. We do anticipate that the full examination and statutory testing cycle will come back into play in 2021. We are still awaiting guidance from the Secretary of State as to any potential delay on the examination period, particularly at Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. There has been a consultation that was undertaken with Ofqual during August, and we are awaiting the outcome of that consultation to see whether or not the Secretary of State wishes to include extra teaching time for those current cohorts before they take their examinations next summer. So we're waiting to hear about that. In terms of support for schools and thinking about the way in which we've been working with schools, we have been running the round tables and the leadership drop-ins that I think I mentioned the last time we met. We had a leadership drop-in this morning, and a really strong representation of head teachers were there for an hour around the virtual table, looking at how they have been opening up schools over the last 4 or 5 days. We shared experiences in terms of how staggered starts were working, the impact of that on some traffic reduction that some schools were able to identify around their sites, and a greater uptake of parents walking to school, noticing that parents were being very helpful in following the guidance around the drop-off times and the pick-up times. Thinking about the some of the operational matters in relation to school meals, and how they're enabling children to access school meal provision within school, and have play times in a COVID secure operation in line with PHE guidance, and keeping children within the bubbles as they move around school. We also talked about practicing for fire drills, and how we were going to be able to do that in a COVID secure way following the one-way systems that schools have got in place, and looking at how children, parents and staff had responded over the last 5 or 6 days. In the main, very positive feedback from heads who were saying it was great to be almost normal and have a sense of normality with a school full of cheerful voices, rather than a little quieter than it had been during the early part of the summer term, and that they were really pleased to be working with children who in the main had come back very happy and contented back to school. They were working in particular with some children who for particular individual reasons might be finding it more difficult to come to school, and they're working closely with those families, supporting them to make the transition back to school. They've spent a lot of time over the period from the original return to school guidance coming out in early July up until this point, working with us on talking through their plans and sharing with each other as a community how they can make the return to school work the most effectively. One of the things that we've spoken about previously is the fact that each school site is quite different to the next school site. And even if the site looks similar, the access points might be different, and the organisation of the building and the classrooms within it are different. And so we've done quite a bit of messaging around how provision in one school and the access arrangements in another school might look quite different because of the different gating and routes arranged and the transport to and from school and where the classrooms are in the building. So quite a lot of pragmatic and operational support has been provided to schools. And I know Sal and I have had quite a few discussions around home to school transport over August and looking at the provision of additional bus routes into school to enable children to be able to get to school, and there be enough capacity in the system to enable that to happen. So Sal, I don't know whether there's anything more that you want to add in terms of that preparation that we've been doing for schools to be able to make the return and the way in which we're supporting them going forward.
Absolutely. Again, in addition to the roundtable activity that Gillian's spoken of, we've reinstated, or I've reinstated, my daily communications to all head teachers, whereby we signpost to updated national guidance, we flag local events related to COVID support that they can access and resources. Some of the other things that we will be doing is supporting schools to make best use, most benefit of things like the catch-up premium. So the catch-up premium equates to, I think it's about £80 per child, and an increased amount of about 240 for children in special schools or alternative provision, which will be funded to each school, split over a termly basis. And that's to enable schools to additional funding to respond to areas where they've identified there's a real need to support students in terms of A, catching up, and B, responding to some of the experience that they've had previously during lockdown when they've not been in school. We've also introduced, more so for our secondary schools, COOTH, which is a mental health and wellbeing online resource that young people can access anonymously and get emotional health and wellbeing support through that. Gillian mentioned home to school transport, and we have been putting on additional vehicles to make sure that we've got dedicated transport provision to each school rather than buses that drop off at one school and then go on to the next, so as to minimise any sorts of transmission risks. We're working incredibly closely with our public health colleagues in order to manage and effectively support schools around outbreak management. So if there are suspected cases, or if there are cases where schools have are clear that there are confirmed cases of COVID within their school community, that they are actively supported to manage them quickly, swiftly and effectively in the best interests of that whole school community. Some of that will be managed locally, and some of that will be supported by the local public the local public health team. We've also got the programme or a number of programmes that the DfE are rolling out, such as Return to Wellbeing. So we're galvanising a whole range of support in and around schools. We are mindful not to overwhelm schools, which is why having the round tables to enable those system leaders to understand what's available and then make best use as it relates to their school. So similar to what Gillian was saying about the different ways schools are laid out, It's also how schools best want to manage some of those return support arrangements that are available to them. So we are absolutely doing everything we can to make it a really, really smooth start and a continued supportive arrangement over certainly the first 2 terms of schools as schools respond to children returning. I hope that's helpful in terms of a bit of further information.
And I think just to add to that, Sal, I'm sure I recall members asking a question previously about whether we were sharing good practice and learning from other jurisdictions about their return to school. And just to indicate that the leadership drop-in roundtable today, we looked at the learning from the first 3 weeks of the return to school in Scotland, for example, and picked up on Scotland's experience so that leaders could take that away with a sense of what they might expect over the next couple of weeks if we were to run in exactly the same way as Scotland schools had experienced. So we are also sharing that wider practice with colleagues so that they can make the best informed judgments that they can about their own practice at a local level.
Andy Craw, you've got your hand up.
Oops. Okay, I do have my hand up. Oh, it's gone a bit dark. Thank you. You were talking about school meal provision, Gillian, and it's been drawn to my attention that some primary schools are no longer serving hot meals, and this is because of the difficulty in getting children in and out of dining rooms. And for some children, this will be the only hot meal they're going to expect during the day. And I was wondering if any of the schools, or if we are supporting any of the schools looking at any sort of temporary outdoor provisions, say like a marquees or anything like that, to allow children who need their hot meal at school to carry on getting hot meals. I'm sorry, it's so specific.
That's all right. I think one of the things around school meals is in the same way in which the schools are approaching everything at the moment, is that they're trying to build up towards things, and I think they're working through the kind of packed lunch process helps them in a more easily delivery mode than the hot meal does. It's also about working in partnership with our catering providers and what our catering providers feel equally they are able to manage, because not all of our schools have a hot kitchen. So some of those meals have to be transported, and it's looking at the logistics of being able to put the whole system back together in the way in which it was before. So my feeling is from feedback from schools is that they're kind of starting slowly with what they know they can make work, in order to then begin to be able to build other things in.
Thank you. But is there an expectation then within all schools that they will at some point have hot meals for the children during the day?
I would say
it takes them to get there.
I would say it was an aspiration to achieve, yes. I think it's not we're not ever going to do it, it's how do we work towards it.
Yeah. And is it something that crops up regularly on your or your team's discussions with the schools in terms of, right, where are we, how long will it be before we have this?
School meals was certainly a topic of discussion this morning.
Okay, I hope every time. I mean, I'm coming from the background of the amount of sort of food poverty and almost
absolutely
the last 3 or 4 months. Okay, all right.
And I think schools are very aware of that, and it's how they try and make the best use of the space and capacity they've got to achieve as much as they can at the moment.
Yeah, I guess my question was about, are they looking at increasing their capacity? Because you can't change the physical infrastructure of a school. You can't build a brick building over a few months, but you can use temporary structures. Is that a topic which has come up? I'm asking in particular, the use of temporary structures.
It hasn't come up in relation to structures and space. It's more about the organisation and the throughput of children, and the sanitisation of spaces after being used. So a number of schools at the moment, for example, are using class-based spaces to eat the packed lunches in, which works more effectively for a cold meal option than it does for a hot meal option. So as they begin to experiment, and a number of heads themselves were actually delivering meals to the classroom. So some of them actually dropped off the call today in order to go and deliver meals to classrooms. So it's about how they're going to work with that capacity going forward, and also picking up with the catering service about the catering services capacity also to be able to serve those meals.
I guess where I'm coming from is that having sort of seen, say, large army outdoor mess halls catering for large numbers of people, and given that they're very well ventilated, or they can be as well ventilated as you want them to be, in many ways, it seems to me, as an amateur, that it actually might be worthwhile the schools looking at this.
Yeah.
Is everyone frozen?
Sorry, you suddenly froze there.
Okay. No, I think it is worth exploring.
Yeah, thank you.
If I may, just on that point, Councillor Croy, I'm more than happy, as you suggest, to kind of share those ideas with schools. One of the bits of guidance that they will have had from the DFE previously is that the expectation from the Department for Education is that there isn't a need for additional structure and additional element, which is why many schools may have chosen not to go down that route, because ultimately one of the things we do need to recognise is that there will be additional cost to those things, and the DFE have very clearly said, and the ESFA have clearly said, that there will be no additional budgetary arrangements made available to schools to fund those sorts of things. So that might also be part of the head teacher decision making around the most effective use of their school budgets, in order to also make sure that they are providing appropriately for all the children in their care during the school day. Just some considerations.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, I think it would also be relevant, I think, for heads or the department or the council to say, well, actually, how much money do we need to make sure that this happens? I think it's one thing to work within existing resources, but there is also a point to be made where we say, actually, the resources we've got aren't enough for what we want to do, where we need to provide those extra spaces.
Absolutely, and I think that's part of our ongoing dialogue with schools and head teachers to understand their ongoing needs as well.
Okay, thank you.
Could I perhaps ask a question? Alison, is that okay?
Yes, that's fine. Go ahead, Andrew.
Okay, thanks. I'd just like to get, firstly, thank you, Gillian and Sal, for your very, very clear and really interesting reports. Much appreciated. I'd just like a little bit more detail about two things. Firstly, you've spoken very positively about the roundtables, and I'd just like a little bit more information about how the roundtables actually operate. Is it combined primary and secondary schools? Are the academies participating? What's the frequency of meetings? Are there any plans to increase frequency in the short to medium term, to help ideas and concerns during this this important return to school period? So a bit more information about the roundtables. And secondly, the catch-up premium. Can we just clarify exactly how that is allocated? Is it simply a per capita grant to each school, not based on any socioeconomic criteria? Do schools have to apply for the catch-up premium? If so, has that been happening? Or is there any evidence of any schools being a little bit tardy? And very critically, is the money when is this money expected to flow through, if it hasn't already been received?
Okay, shall I make a start on the, I'll start with the round tables. So we have a programme, and I've just grabbed my programme to refer to. So if I explain how the programme works, and this is something that, as you can imagine, colleagues, has been kind of developing iteratively since March, when schools were invited to close their doors to the full range of children. And we started at that point with a leadership drop-in so that heads could just come together. We use this platform, and an invitation goes out to all head teachers' calendars, and they're able to drop in literally if they choose to do so. In response to your question around who is invited, absolutely every head teacher in a government-funded school in the borough, so academy, free school, and state and community school, church school, they're all invited, primary and secondary. And actually we get a really good mix of people coming. I'd say anything from sort of 20 to 45 on a call. We've run them every week without fail, from the 20th of March onwards through school holidays up until the 21st of July. And we've had attendance at all of them. We have a programme now running again from this term right the way through till Christmas. And the leadership drop-ins are the ones that the head said that they definitely wanted to continue. I tend to chair them, and I said to them, you kind of must have been bored of hearing my voice now. And they said, no, we want to continue meeting together. And there were a goodly number on the call this morning, probably another 25 on the call, primary and secondary, academy and community heads together. And it's really a facilitated discussion. So as I indicated earlier, I shared the information around, what was happening in Scotland and the learning from that. And then we invited discussion about what the learning was that they were experiencing from the last 5 or 6 days in terms of their own practice. And then I shared some research. We always share some research with them and indicate good practice. So somebody was asking about how they might need to return to remote teaching. It's one of the things that Ofsted are going to be asking the question of in a conversation. And we've indicated that our leadership drop-ins over the next 3 or 4 weeks will look at how they have a plan ready by the 30th of September, because that's the DfE requirement, that they are ready to make a switch from face-to-face teaching to remote teaching. So we've got those foci. And then what we also have is we've allocated we call them twilight sessions. So they're the 4 till 5 o'clock after school slot on a Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday evening to subject specific roundtables, where we're engaging with a broader range of leaders across schools and across the system. We've got our Voice 21 Oracy project group that come together. We've got anybody who's involved in assessment. And we've got several sessions looking at assessment, which has been particularly pertinent, as you can imagine, over this period, understanding what's happening in terms of changed statutory requirements, but also about how schools are assessing where children are. And what we're looking at for this half term is how schools are assessing what that gap in learning might be. And then that takes us into another series of sessions about best practice in terms of pedagogies for catch-up, and looking at the way in which we might deliver the curriculum. So we've also got some roundtable discussions on recovery curriculum examples, and we did some with our educational psychology service during the latter part of the summer term as well. Then, as I mentioned, we've got our Pan Berkshire pupil premium and free school meal focus group. So that's happening as a round table. We've also got some work happening on the prevent agenda and safeguarding. And looking at rolling out the Return to Wellbeing programme for schools, which is a DfE programme. So we are training schools to be able to train their staff. So we've got sessions looking at that. We've got specific sessions for deputy heads, specific sessions for early years foundation stage leaders, specific sessions on transition. So we ran a big transition group looking at how schools were getting children ready for the change prior to the summer holiday. And what we're doing this half of term is working with schools to capture what they felt worked best, so that we can hold that onto that for them and remind them of that as we approach next summer. So we want to capture that before they kind of lose that thinking. So that just kind of gives you a flavour of the kind of things that we've been looking at in the round tables. And of course, as Sal said, we will also be having specific ones looking at that catch-up premium, which was your second question. So we will be looking at how they will spend that money. One of the tools that we've already flagged to them is the Education Endowment Foundation material, which is a evidence and research based organisation. It's the biggest one in the UK and actually is now developing international renown. And they have a suite of tools that we've already signposted schools to over time in relation to free school meals and pupil premium best practice. They have produced already a toolkit around the catch-up requirements, which is a tiered approach that looks at quality first teaching, then intervention, and then wider strategies. And so those are the conversations that we're having with school leaders. We started that conversation with an early flag this morning. Some schools had already tuned into that research document and were looking at it during August. So our round table around the catch-up premium will be focused on using that as an evidence-based practice for them to be able to work with. To answer your question around the funding, it is a per head £80 per head. It's going to come in 2 tranches. It won't arrive until later this term, and it will come over the 2 tranches through till next summer. And that will also include access to the National Tutoring Programme, which comes on stream in November.
Thank you very much.
You're muted.
Sorry, again, it went on again. Can I make a small point? I am conscious of the time, so it's not really a question. It's more, Gillian. It's very, very interesting. Gillian Ansell, very interesting and informative. Could you just take away with you a small point, which is, I know you've got an awful lot to think about, but one of the things that is starting to concern me is the economic position of many families is likely to get worse. Could you somehow fit into these discussions you're having with schools something about school uniform and making it affordable for people, or having, beefing up their schemes for second-hand uniforms and not having items which are specialist provision? Badges for your blazer is fine, but not having to go to a shop to buy a special tie that costs £17 and those kind of things, because I just think the pressure on families is enough already. And if you can squash that in, I'd be really grateful.
Okay.
Okay, if members are happy, can we move on to looking at the Ofsted reports, Gillian?
Ofsted reports. There aren't any Ofsted reports because there have been no inspections.
Okay, that's very good. And shall we now? We're going to do part 2 now? No. Right, no.
Do the forward plan.
You've got the forward plan to talk about before you move into part 2.
Oh, right. Okay. Yes, that's true. Very true. Right. The forward plan. So our next meeting has got a packed agenda because we're hoping to be graced with the presence of the Regional Schools Commissioner, Dame Kate. And we will be, I think I will write to her, and we will write to various other people to encourage the Regional Schools Commissioner to attend, because it's very important that they are accountable. So also on the agenda of the next meeting, we're looking at CAMS, very importantly, and we've got school performances. I'm struggling to get the document up in front of me here.
Councillor Swaddle.
Yes.
if I may, I was just wondering in terms of the November meeting, the standing item on school performance indicators and Ofsted reports. We're unlikely to, as Gillian has said, Ofsted are not reinstating their inspections until after the autumn term. So to create some space, you might want to, as a one-off,
we could
remove that item from the November agenda, because we will not have anything to report in.
Well, we did agree that we didn't need to have things as a standing item every meeting, because there's one in the year, isn't there, where there's never going to be any data because of the way the meetings fall with the quarters. So yeah, that would be a very wise idea.
And that, yeah, so I just think that might help with the timetabling, because you've got a fairly packed one.
Would really help if I could get this up in front of me. Can somebody put it up? That would be very helpful.
Sorry, I thought I'd shared my screen.
Yeah, you
Can
were,
you see
but
it
I was busy looking on my computer to try and find it.
Sorry, I shared it.
So, Sal, the school places sufficiency, is that report definitely going to be ready for us to discuss?
I will have to check with colleagues in school place planning to double check whether that paper should be ready for us. I'm hoping that it would be.
Right.
May I ask a question about that particular item?
Yeah, go on.
Is that going to include a report on sixth form places?
I'm sure that it will include an element that relates to post-16 provision as part of the broader overview of school placements, although it's likely to be a smaller part of the whole report.
No, that's fine. It's just I think we could do with an update on where we are with it.
I will check.
Post-16 provision could be a separate item at some point, perhaps, Prue.
It could.
Yes, if you could include that in the report for our November meeting, that would be great. And then in January, we're looking at the SEND strategy and child exploitation. Yeah, which and we've got the performance indicators for both areas. March, we could be looking at, yes, we could look at something that had been suggested, members. Councillor Croy had raised with me perhaps looking at diversity and equality in schools, because we have asked many times that Children's Services could provide as a standing item the permanent exclusions. Now, I will accept that probably no schools had any permanent exclusions last term when they weren't there, but we would like to be receiving the permanent exclusions data and told which children with SEND had a permanent exclusion. Councillor Croy had raised with me, and we have asked Sal about also having reported the incidence of racial incidents in schools, which schools are obliged to report, but there is an issue of that they're not uniformly defined, and there isn't a standard form to easily be able to create a borough-wide picture to be able to report to the committee. Sal, were you able to look at that?
It is the case that schools should be recording racist incidents. Many of them do that as part of or a subset of their anti-bullying arrangements. They are asked to report through to their governing body or trustee arrangements, but there's no requirement for them to formally report that in to the local authority. some years ago, we did ask for that information, and the experience was that it came in a fashion that didn't give us a reliable sense across the borough, i.e., not all schools shared it, and not all schools shared it in the same way, which meant that it was very difficult to get a real sense of trend, issues, or validity around it. However, I think given the very recent sense of scrutiny around anti-racist activity, I think it is something that we will be and are engaging schools with. So we can certainly make that request of them again in terms of our broader work with schools around anti-racist practice.
Andy?
Yeah, thank you, Sal. I mean, I think practice, when you say practice, at the moment, I'm sort of more concerned about the recording and making sure that schools are recording their incidents, not just of racism, but of other hate crimes, in such a way that the results are comparable. Because if the results aren't comparable between schools, that then raises, because they have different thresholds at which incidents are recorded, that then raises the possibility that incidents that would be recorded in one school aren't being recorded in another school, and that then leads on to the possibility that there's actually under-recording or not recording or misrecording of incidents. So I think I would love to see a standardization exercise. I know that many schools are experienced in the working together and making sure that their, for example, exam marks are standardized across schools. I don't think it's beyond the wit of our excellent teachers to do the same for racist and other hate crime recording. And even if there's no recording, sort of formal putting of data into the borough, but as part of their normal reporting to their governors, so that we can pick up any set of reports to the governors and pick up the data from there. But we need to be able to look at different schools and compare them.
Absolutely, and we have been engaging with governors through our governor support services, specifically on the issue of reporting, to make sure that they are aware that they should be receiving the reports of any events in their schools or any incidents in their schools, and highlighting to them the importance of capturing the data in a way that's usable for them in terms of improvement and response. We can suggest to schools some guidance around how they might wish to do that, and ultimately it is each school's responsibility for their own policy arrangements of how they apply them. But certainly through our governor support and school improvement support to schools, we can provide them with some guidance in terms of best practice around recording arrangements and reporting arrangements, obviously.
Thank you.
Abdul?
Thank you, Chair. I know the time is running. Can I just go back to the PREVENT program? Does the children's parents knows that this program is on board? Maybe Gillian can enlighten a bit more.
If I may, Councillor Lloyd,
Yeah.
we're actively engaged in PREVENT, and we share information and information that can be shared with parents around the PREVENT agenda. Clearly, we don't necessarily involve parents in the detail of cases as they're being managed, unless it relates to their individual children. But we absolutely do share information that makes sure that schools are aware of their PREVENT duties, are aware of the Prevent arrangements and do have information that they can share more broadly with their school communities. I hope that helps.
Yes, can I just one more question relating to that? I thought this was done by the local police authority. However, is this for particularly one religious group, or is it for everyone?
No, Prevent is across the piece. It's a multi-agency, whilst it is led by the police in terms of counter-terrorism and anti-radicalisation. It does not focus specifically on any religious or cultural group. It's concerned with all forms of potential radicalisation as part of our counter-terrorism approach. Children's services are actively involved in the Prevent agenda and the Prevent meetings. In fact, as the Assistant Director, I chair Channel Board, which very closely links to Prevent agenda.
Okay, that leads me into another question.
Abdul, I'm conscious that it's now 10 o'clock. And we would normally have aimed to finish at 10 o'clock.
Okay.
Would members be willing to continue until 10:15, just to
just
can I
to clarify, Alison, you can carry on until 10:30, according to our constitution.
I know, but you know.
If it just gets a bit of
okay, right, okay. Can you put your hand up if you're happy to continue until 10:30 at the latest?
I'd like to hear more of Abdul's questions as well.
Oh, that's fine. I just realised the time and thought we do need to have just got your approval to continue. Right, Abdul, would you like to continue?
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Chair, for your time you're giving me. I'm just a little bit concerned. People like ourselves in Wokingham Borough, do we have any sort of highly concerned children within our community, or which we need to look into more further than what we are doing at the moment?
At the moment in Wokingham, we don't have any Prevent cases. In fact, we haven't had Prevent cases that have met the threshold for Prevent for quite some time. However, there are instances where children and young people or adolescents come to our attention, and in those instances we are always minded to understand whether there are any potential radicalisation impacts on that child, amongst any other safeguarding arrangements that we need to concern ourselves with children. But Wokingham for quite some time has not been an area where there have been either children or adults cases in respect of Prevent.
Okay, that's really reassuring. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alison. I'm good.
I think you might be muted, Councillor Swaddle.
Thank you, Sal. I was. So we were looking at the forward programme with a view to considering scrutinising diversity, and equality for our children in schools, with a focus on being active anti-racism within schools. Could that be something we could look at in the March meeting, Sal?
I'm sure that we can provide a report that gives a sense of what the system is doing in respect of anti-racism and diversity and inclusion, and also what Woking Borough Council services are doing, so the school improvement services, in terms of supporting schools in that respect. So yeah, happy to pull a report together for the March meeting.
Okay, Adam.
Yeah, thank you. We mentioned earlier that there was a request for a report on the measures being taken to reduce repeat child protection plans. So is that something you wanted to schedule in, or was it a supplementary report?
When is it that when in the year do you have the data to enable you to report on that?
I think this was, if I recall, this was more looking back at the measures we'd taken to reduce the previous high figure.
Okay. Somebody's whizzing their screen up and down and pointing. Do you think we could fit that in November? Or well, I think January might be best for that. Yeah, can we have that in January, please, Adam?
Okay.
Members, I wondered if we wanted to review, you know, the well, basically the COVID response, having a point to look back at it in March. Anybody have a view about doing that? Prue?
No. Sorry, I'm fine. Yes, I can't work out whether my microphone's on or off half the time. No, I think March would be fine. So I'm wilting a bit. It's getting quite hot here.
I know. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. So back to the agenda. So nothing more to say about that. Are we ready to move to part 2 then? I think so. So item 23, the exclusion of the public under section 100A brackets 4 of the Local Government Act. The public are excluded from the meeting for the following items of business on the grounds that they involve the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined in paragraph 3 of part 1 of schedule 12A of the Act, brackets as amended, close brackets, as appropriate. So we will be leaving YouTube at this point, and we'd like to thank everybody who's taken the time to follow the meeting.